Welcome to Life is Beautiful. I'm Anthony. Today we are going to be talking about a lesser known beer style. Although it's not really fair to say lesser known because it is still actually a relatively popular beer style in its homeland. However, I don't think it gets as much attention or is even as well known as it should be around the world, which is rather ironic because today we are going to be talking about Germanic export beers. Export beer is a bottom fermented lager, typically in the 5 to 6 ABV range, and can be easily found in either the Helles or Dunkel formats. The body is typically crystal clear regardless of its color. It boasts a full medium to light body, moderate carbonation, and a full white bubbly head. The flavor widely depends on the malts used, but typically seem crackery in the lighter versions and breadier in the dark versions. Export beer is not sweet, but not necessarily dry either, and the alcohol should not stand out. The typical IBU in the lighter versions range between 20 to 30 IBU, and the darker versions are able to bump all the way up to the 40s. Now, the more beer style aware of you out there might be thinking, that looks and sounds a lot like a Pilsner. And to be fair, I gotta say, it is kind of in this weird amalgamation of the Germanic pale lager world where it could be easily misidentified as a Pilsner. However, the more you drink them and the more intimate you become with them, the more you realize there are some significant differences. First and foremost, the malt bill is actually a little bit different. Export beer will typically have a little bit more malt used and actually slightly darker. So we're talking 1 to 2 SRM, but not a whole lot. Your typical export beer is going to be ranging in the 12 to 13 degrees Plato, where your Pilsners are going to be all the way down in the 10 to 11 Plato. And those degrees actually end up translating into very noticeable ABVs. Your typical Pilsner isn't oftentimes going to break that 5% barrier, and if it does, it's minute. Where the export beer actually starts at the 5, and you can see it going all the way up to almost 7% in some of the further south offerings. And that might not sound like the biggest difference, but I mean, it is. Historically, when export beers actually arrived at their destinations, tavern owners and bar managers would actually cut the export beer with water to make them less spicy. The last big difference is the perception of hop bitterness and hop flavor between the Pilsner and the export beer. Typically, you are going to notice Pilsners to be a little bit hoppier. And that's because many of the major waterways in Germany have large amounts of calcium, especially around areas where export beer became famous like Dortmund and Munich. When high levels of calcium interact with the isomerized alpha acids in hops, you end up with a very astringent and harsh flavor as well as a scratchy mouthfeel in your beer. Now, the Bohemians who originally brewed the Pilsner did not necessarily have that same problem. In fact, they actually had water that was perfectly attuned for lighter malted beers with a higher hop content, which allowed Pilsner brewers to actually use much more hops in their beer, which is why we have such distinctive and drastic differences between the perceived hop bitterness and the overall IBU between Germanic export beers and Pilsners. So although the export beer is still a rather hoppy and could be considered bitter for your pale lagers, it is ironically paled in comparison to the Pilsner, and it's all those differences, it's all those little tweaks and changes that allows the export beer to live up to its purpose, to its intended result, and that is to be exported and delivered and received as a quality product. The Germanic export beers kind of break up into 3 broad categories: the Dortmunder export, the Munich export, and the last category is a little bit harder to describe because it's not necessarily an exact beer style in the sense that the Dortmunder export and the Munich export beers are. Instead, it's more of a rather vague, kind of ambiguous marketing term, which you could argue does have some sub-style categories within it, but we'll get to that later. All of which have their own unique identity, all of which share a common purpose, a common mission to be exported. So let's get in a little bit to the history and the origins of the export beer. Dortmund had a long history of brewing very interesting, very unique, hyper localized beer styles like the Atom beer. And that took years of maturation. And, as the unstoppable tidal wave of the Pilsner rampaged across Germany, some of these beer styles kind of died out and became pushed to the wayside in favor of pale lagers. Things kind of started to change around the beginning of the 20th century, where brewing industrial complexes kind of got set up in Germany, and they cared less about quality and they started focusing a lot more on mass production. Breweries had to produce more and more beer to stay competitive in their own markets, and that was pushing some of the smaller breweries out and starting to form a little bit of like beer monopolies. The only real solution Dortmund breweries had was to be able to get their beer out of the hyper-competitive Dortmund scene and get it out into other areas that were less saturated, and that way they could put their full force into new markets to be able to get their foothold in and stay profitable. They had one major problem. The mineral content in the local waterways was incredibly high, which resulted in very poorly brewed pale lagers. Something had to happen, something had to change, or else the Dortmund brewery industry was going to collapse due to the overwhelming saturation, due to the overwhelming tide of imported pilsners. And luckily for Dortmund, a savior was about to arrive. Heinrich Winker was a Braumeister trained in the art of Bavaria lager making. During his tutelage in Munich, he saw the rise of the Bohemian Pilsner and the corresponding Helles lager. Later, he apprenticed in Vienna to learn the Vienna art of the Vienna lager. In fewer words, Winker was probably the most experienced, the most foremost expert in pale lager production in probably all of North Germany at this point in time. His first mission was to introduce new brewing techniques and technology into Dortmund that would give them a little bit of a competitive edge against other rival cities in the area like Köln and Dusseldorf. And those things were water analysis and refrigerated lagering. He did tons of experimentation to figure out a way to change the water profile, adding minerals, figuring out ways to subdue the ones that were currently existing, filter them out. That way he could be able to get a water profile more similar to that down in Bavaria, where he could produce something similar, akin to a Helles lager. He was finally able to get the water profile adjusted just right, where pale malts and hoppier flavored beers would actually not be awful. So he was rather successful in his experimentation. Now, it wasn't quite as pale or as hoppy as the Pils, and it wasn't quite as clean and perfect as the Helles lager. But what it was a regional adaptation of the concept of pale lager brewings that fit Dusseldorf's water profile perfectly. His final last adaptation to the methodology was to bump that ABV up just a little bit that would allow it to survive exportation down the Rhine River. In 1843, Mr. Heinrich Winker invented the export lager. Once the local blue-collar workers, the ferrymen, the harbormen, the miners, the farmers around the region, once they kind of adapted it as their go-to daily drinking beer, I mean, it really became a staple in the community. It was the beer of the city. Exportbier really put Dortmund back on the map, at least as far as being a noticeable beer destination goes. In fact, at one point in time, after the mass surge in popularity behind the Exportbier, Dortmund became one of the most well-known and highest-selling beer cities in all of Germany. But with all things beer, once something becomes innovative, once something becomes successful, it must be replicated. Munich, in general, all of Bavaria, had been kind of like frantically trying to redesign their beer image because historically they had been very, very bad at brewing beer. Kind of hard to hear nowadays since they are so wildly successful and so wildly known for their beer brewing. But at this point in time, they weren't. And when the Pilsner became a huge, to-do, they felt very threatened. So they came out with the Helles. And then the export beer started coming down back towards them, and they had to figure out a way to adapt their brewing style to fight off both the Pilsner and the Dortmund export beer. So Munich was actually going to follow Dortmund's lead. If they were going to start exporting far and wide, pushing their beers out to new markets in order to capitalize off of, less competitive areas, Munich needed to do the same thing. They needed to get their beers out into the world. That way they could fight off and make more money and fight off the Bohemians and the Dortmunders. Munich started pushing their ABVs even higher. Where Dortmund was going around 12 to 13 degrees Plato, we started seeing Munich going all the way up from 13 to 16 degrees Plato, somewhere around 5.5 to almost 7 ABV. Looking at these three examples I have here, I think the average is around 5.5, which for all my Dortmunder boys over here, they typically come in at around 5 to 5.2. So again, not a huge jump, but definitely noticeable. That extra couple, .0 points, whatevers, they add up a little bit. The typical Munich export is certainly much darker than Dortmunder's, thanks to the utilization of Munich-style barley malts. Additionally, the presence of Dunkel exports is rather common in Bavaria, whereas in Dortmund, they are almost nearly non-existent. Which makes sense because, still to this day, Munich is holding on dearly to their darker beers, their dark lagers to be specific, whereas up in Dortmund, they were trying their hardest, their damnedest to be able to escape the dark beer brewing process. Interestingly, the Munich export beer is largely less hop than even the Dortmunder, due to Bavaria's concerns with their high calcium content in their water. Hence why they probably focused on larger or higher ABVs as opposed to larger IBUs. That way it would still be safe for exportation. But it is kind of weird because even though it is less hoppy, less utilized hops, less isomerized alpha acids, I've noticed in my own perception that the Bavarian export beers, they smell hoppier. So I don't know if they just kind of shifted around the process of when the hops are actually added into the boil, but definitely more aromatic, less on the taste. The Munich export is its own unique entity, its own unique subcategory of the beer style. It is vastly different than the Dortmund export. It is its own unique thing. I think that's what kind of makes it special, both of these, is that they both uniquely define and represent the characteristics of a very regional flavor preference. So the final category of Germanic export beer is a little bit more complicated to define than what we have previously discussed, because whereas the Munich export beer and the Dortmunder export beer, where they could be considered their own beer style or even subcategories of the greater export beer style, this third category is more of a marketing term. There are tons of different beers throughout Germany that market themselves as export. Now, that's not necessarily export beer in the same context, but export in the sense that the brewery was built and designed, their business plan originated in order to export beer instead of produce beer for domestic consumption. In fact, all across Germany, you'll find export Pilsners. That's a really big one. Export Box, you'll find export Hefeweizens. Probably the most famous of all these export marketing beers is the Beck's Pilsner, which itself describes as an export Pilsner. So I just really wanted to clarify that because although, yes, it is export and it is German and it is beer, they're drastically different. Now, there is one offering, one subcategory of the marketing. I mean, I feel like we're inception levels deep here, that you could argue is its own kind of sub-style. and that is the Vienna Export Lager. Now, the Vienna Export Lager is essentially just a normal Vienna lager. However, it was bumped up in its ABV in order to survive exportation. In fact, oftentimes for your more reputable sources, you will see Vienna Export in the same category as the Munich and the Dortmunder Export, except it doesn't seem like it was tweaked enough for my personal opinion, but that's why I said there's an argument to be made. So the Vienna Export Lager, I mean, it kind of spun out of the pale lager movement that was occurring across Germany and Austria at that point in time, where we started seeing the birth of like the Oktoberfest, the Marzen, the Vienna Lager. And again, just like in Munich and just like in Dortmund, we saw heavy competition in Vienna where they needed to be able to get their beers out, especially at that time. I'm pretty sure it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there was a ton of landmass that Vienna could export their beers to and still kind of keep it domestic, but shipped out across hundreds of kilometers. In fact, the Vienna Export Lager is actually the strongest out of all the Germanic export beers. In beer historian Andreas Krenmar's quintessential book on Vienna Lager, he shows the measurements of various Vienna lagers across the empire, across time, including several export beers, all of which boast a sky-high starting gravity of around 16. It also seemed that the Vienna Export Lager was insanely popular. In fact, Anton Dreyer, the legend of beer, the inventor of the Vienna Lager, and one of the bringers of pale lagers to all of Germany, he actually completely revamped his own personal brewery to become the Anton Dreyer Export Brewery because export Vienna lagers were just so dang popular. Now, here's the downside. The Vienna Export Lager, it doesn't really exist anymore. I mean, I have tried going way out of my way to be able to hunt down and find a Vienna Export Lager, but it seems like it's just kind of faded away into obscurity. I just cannot find one anywhere. And that is very depressing because apparently it was the darkest of all the Germanic export lagers in addition to being the strongest. It was supposedly everything you liked and love about the Vienna Lager, but just more so. But at the same time, it's also kind of, and this deserves its own video. Hopefully I'll be able to do a deep dive on this one day, but you could argue in some senses it does still kind of exist today through craft beer. Craft Vienna lagers are certainly much stronger than you would find in historic Vienna lager offerings. So, I mean, I guess there's an argument to be made there, but the main point is if you're trying to find it in the traditional brewed methodology, especially from Vienna, from Austria, I have had absolutely no luck in finding something that is still labeled and marketed as Vienna Export, living up to the historical documentation that we have. All right, so now that we got all the subcategories out of the way, let's dive back into the history and wrap it up. So despite the many differences, as we've kind of seen, they all kind of share the same objective, the same function, as well as kind of a similar history, which is what, as I mentioned earlier, kind of defines the style of Germanic export beer. And, for a couple hundred years, they were insanely popular. I mean, they were shipped far and wide. You can find documents of them being shipped all across Europe, up into Scandinavia. I've seen some down into Africa. But they all kind of faded away insanely quickly. And that was unfortunately due to World War I and World War II. Across the globe, we saw huge rise in anti-Germanism, anti-Germanic. People didn't like the Germans very much, and that includes the Austrians and the Swiss and just anyone Germanic. And that kind of stopped all the exportation of Germanic and Austrian beers back into domestic markets. There still was a taste, a craving for a pale lager, especially with a little bit of an alcohol bump in it, but people outside of these homelands were just not interested. So it ironically made the export lager become almost exclusively domestic. Very ironic. Unfortunately, it's just kind of stayed that way ever since. export beer would kind of rise and fall in popularity throughout its origin places. And as I've mentioned, I mean, in Dortmund, it is still the go-to offering, but it would never again see a massive rise where it was just being drastically pumped out across the globe. But things may change because export beer has kind of seen moderate success in the modern day craft beer movement. I mean, there are several breweries that you can find export beers in their constant lineup. Probably the most famous of all is Dortmund Gold from the Great Lakes Brewing Company, where it is one of their quintessential flagship offerings. Although it is not one of the more popular beer styles even in the craft world, I do think there is an opportunity for it to kind of make a resurgence, even if it is in this new craft reinterpretation, because over the past several decades we've seen a sharp spike in ABV consumption, as well as all different types of crazy adjuncts and everything. But we've started seeing that kind of fall off into more focused, cleaner beers, especially lagers. I mean, clean, simple lagers are making a huge rise, and the export beer could fit in perfectly into there, because even with its elevated ABV status in comparison to pilsners and whatnot, it is still significantly lower than your typical crafty stout or IPA. Anyways, if there was ever a time for export beer to kind of make a resurgence, get its name back out there, I think now is the time. I think there's a great opportunity for craft breweries to jump on that opportunity, as well as there are a ton of Germanic export beers still being made to this day that I'm sure their brewers would love to actually get back out into the world. So anyways, this was an incredibly long and way more complicated video than I intended it to be. I pretty much just only knew about Dortmund Lager, and I pretty much only wanted to focus on that, but as you can see, it kind of spiraled out the more I dug into it and learned about it. It's a very fascinating beer style or beer category, whatever you want to call it, because it's just more and more layers to it as you peel back. So I hope you learned something about Germanic export beer. I hope you found this video interesting. And remember, there's a story in every bottle, and that life is beautiful. Cheers.